So.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Shall we start now? Welcome. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. The first panel of today, entitled Uncommon Explorations Between Green Technologies, Climate Hope, and the Anthropological Imagination. I will be chairing this session and the next one, and I will briefly present our wonderful co-conveners, and then we will just start immediately with the first session of this panel. Each presenter will have 15 minutes and 2 minutes for clarification questions, if there are any. And then after that, we will have our discussion for today that we will present here later. That's Simone Abraham, Professor Simone Abraham, and after that we will have a general conversation discussion. So first of all, let me introduce our convener, Pablo Ampuero Ruiz. Pablo has a PhD from the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology and the Martin Luther University of Halle-Wittenberg in Germany. He has conducted fieldwork in the southern Chinese megalopolis of Shenzhen and in Project Walls of Lithium, which is the ERC also that is co-organizing this panel. Pablo focuses on the role of lithium batteries in the imagination of an ecological civilization, this being one of the landmark projects of the Chinese government. He's also looking at how finance capitalism articulates new transformations of lithium as a resource of financial speculation and as an enabler of energy transitions towards a more or less sustainable capitalism. And together with Pablo Ampuero Ruiz, we have Jonas Koppel. Jonas is currently a PhD candidate at the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at the Graduate Institute Geneva. And his dissertation research focused on the political issues surrounding lithium in Bolivia. So there is a tendency to do research on lithium in this panel, where he has conducted extensive ethnographic fieldwork with diverse people involved in the state lithium project. Furthermore, he has been part of 2 research projects at the same institute, comparing the governance of lithium across Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, and more recently, tracing connections between lithium and battery industries across South America and Europe. So thanks, Jonas and Pablo for this wonderful organization of this panel. And Pablo, the floor is yours. You can present the panel.
So we want to give a brief statement of why we organize this panel and what's the idea of when we hear these papers today. What are kind of the precepts we had in mind to bring these people together. So basically what we have been trying to do is to look for ways to think critically about the approaches to energy transitions, particularly the way that solutions are being presented in the hegemonic discourse. We think that the complexity of climate change needs new ways of thinking. That's why it has motivated, this has motivated us to search for concepts that can open up dialogues across different sites, actors, and levels of interaction. So this is a global problem that works at different scales, and this is somehow we need to start addressing and talk from different ethnographic fields and experiences as well. So today we bring this idea of green technologies because we think that it might help us to look at this phenomena across, in this case, sites of extraction, discarding, industrial and financial and consuming practices. So it's a kind of very spread out the different topics that we have, but what we have in the back of our mind is this idea of green technologies, trying to put them into dialogue. So some of the questions that we might ask is, how are green technologies shaping the way decision makers imagine energy transitions, or what kind of climate hopes are nurtured by particular green technologies, and what environmental alternatives can be enacted beyond the development of these green technologies. So basically, this panel is a collective invitation to think together about these hegemonic narratives that promote mostly technofixes, but also to think about the imagination of alternatives. We heard a little bit about this in yesterday's keynote. We thought that, well, she's really providing all the background for our panel. So I guess that is also very inspirational for us. Imagining radical alternatives and maybe the possibility of doing things otherwise. So this is a little bit of the idea that we had in our minds, and that we hope the conversation today goes into this direction of thinking collectively and trying to bring something about. So I leave Jonas now with the logistics before we start with the presentations. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I think we had Cristobal said, but I also have to introduce Cristobal, I said, I think, our chair. Does that work? Just a couple of words. Also, so you know, Cristobal holds a PhD from the University of Edinburgh and has been trained at the intersection of clinical psychology, social anthropology, and science and technology studies. And he's the PI of the ERC-funded project, Worlds of Lithium, which focuses on the socio-technical transformations around the lithium industry, from Chile to China to Norway, also around across these different sites. So Cristobal will be leading us through this session and the next one. I just wanted to say a couple of words too. Cristobal said already, so it's the kind of framework is these 15 minutes. Please stick to the time. Cristobal will be reminding you of kind of towards the end of when before your time is up, a couple of minutes before that. And for people online, just please, if you want to contribute something or ask questions, etc., post them, write them in the chat, or you can also raise your hand, and in the discussion then we'll ask the question for you if you wrote in the chat, or we'll give you the floor. And for people in the room who want to ask questions, you'll have to come to the front, because the microphone only works here. So we'll have to do that in a more or less bit sequential way, right? We cannot have an open discussion, I guess, because it's important to also include people online. Yes, so much for the logistics, I think. So we'll leave the floor to Cristobal to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
So let's get started with our first speaker, Dr. Marina Weinberg. Marina holds a PhD in anthropology from the Binghamton University Sun, and she is currently a senior researcher at the ERC Starting Ground Project Worlds of Lithium that Jonas already presented. And she is the leader of the work package on Chile, where she studies how lithium connects and transforms landscapes and societies in the Atacama Desert, where some of the biggest lithium deposits are located. Her recent research has concentrated on the material and social dynamics of mineral extraction in northern Chile, focusing on the ways in which the materiality of copper and lithium has affected and reshaped bodies and worlds within and beyond the Atacama Desert. Marina is also affiliated with the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology in San Pedro de Atacama at the University Católica del Norte, where she is assistant professor since 2016. So, Marina, the floor is yours. I will let you know minute 12. So you will have 3 minutes when I say you, Marina. We are okay. Minute 12. Okay. Perfect.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for being here, and thank you Jonas and Pablo and Cristobal for organizing the panel. And I will start with my presentation. So, lithium carbonate meet Marina, Marina meet lithium carbonate. With this unpredictably formal introduction, I could not decide whether it was the end of my search or the beginning. I didn't know what to say, but nice to meet you, lithium didn't come out. I felt accomplished to have gained access to the SQM chemical plant, one of the 2 companies that has put Chile among the top 3 lithium producing countries in the world for several decades. I felt suffocated after a few hours visiting the plant where brain is processed to obtain lithium carbonate and lithium hydroxide. I remembered a similar sensation coming out of the never-ending human anthill that became the Cerro Rico silver mine in Potosí, Bolivia, many years ago. You can touch it, I was told, interrupting my memory. I was escorted by 3 people on the tour, and we were getting to the end, the bagging sector, where both my visit and the plant's production line finished. Wearing the safety glove they have given me, I plunged my hand into a bag of 500 kilos of lithium carbonate. They insisted, you can't touch it. Take off your glove and touch it. So I did. Surprised, I exclaimed that it was incredibly soft. The engineer told me, it's like powder sugar. And he continued, there is also crystallized, micronized. The difference is minimal. It depends on the client's use. We are talking about sugar here, not salt, end quote. Since that was supposed to be a joke, I kind of laughed politely, but I was anxious with keeping my lithium hand away from my face until I could wash it. So far, there is no certified correlation between exposure to lithium carbonate and human diseases, as there is, for example, for direct contact with lithium hydroxide or inhalation of metallic particulate matter or ashes. Still, meshing my unprotected body with a product that will be part of a sealed battery with an element that offers an unusual capacity for storage and production of electric energy was disturbing. In fact, while finishing this presentation, I came across news informing that the European Chemicals Agency's Risk Assessment Committee is now reviewing a set of published documents suggesting that it might be necessary to classify 3 lithium salts as category 1A, reproductive toxicants. This proposal has determined that lithium carbonate, lithium hydroxide, and lithium chloride should be classified under the classification, labeling, and packaging regulation as substances that may damage fertility and unborn children, and it also agreed that the substances may harm breastfeed children. The univocal assumption that the production of lithium and its byproducts will yield a transition towards the so-called clean green energy deletes the real environmental impacts of lithium mining in the regions of the planet from which this soft metal is extracted. This is certainly the case at the confluence of Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. Several fundamental works have detailed how this water-intensive extractive activity relies on fragile local ecologies. My ethnographic research focuses on what have been identified as off-sites of lithium extraction, less observed spaces that exist beyond the core of the Salar de Atacama. Off-sites are heavily transformed spaces that frame the path from the salt flats to the spaces where chemical plants are located, and from these industrial facilities to the port, from where the final product will be distributed around the world. The widespread imaginary of brain removal places romanticizes extensive salt flats and striking blue-green pools. However, extraction processes have also generated massive infrastructures, material systems, intangible damages, affectations on human and non-human beings, and the establishment of socio-technical imaginaries, which have been normalized over time. It is undeniable that the farther one moves away from the world-famous brain pools, the dirtier the landscape becomes. Despite this kind of Instagrammable images that are used by the companies to aesthetize the disaster, these environments are dystopian archetypical of science fiction movies. The perfect landscapes of the pools start to change as we move away from the nucleus of the salar. As we leave the extraction area, we begin to glimpse what one could call the rubbish dump of lithium. These are endless spaces where the remains of unused or wasted materials accumulate, including hose parts, empty metal containers, rusty signs, and even uninstalled light poles and cables. My work problematizes the notion that to achieve energy transition through reliance of lithium, a greater development of mining is required. In northern Chile, companies continue to rely on fossil fuels for all the processes necessary for extraction, production, and transportation. In general terms, I would frame my exploration within an anthropology of mining and not within an anthropology of energy or transitions, because the global processes within which we frame the transition towards a green and sustainable future seem to be simply finding new strategies that allow the perpetuation of the mining industry itself. At least for now, that's the case of Chile. I argue that there is no such a thing as energy transition, but as far as we can see in this area of the world, there is a mining transition, complemented by new discourses and paradigms around green alternatives that energize this unstoppable industry. An industry that is still based on oil and coal. At this point, we don't see any clean energy without polluted energy. When we look at the offsites, it becomes very evident that to guarantee the transition to clean energy, not only are local ecologies within the salt flats going to continue to be affected, but infrastructures will continue to expand. These material arrangements have a much wider geographical coverage than the extraction areas itself. Workers' camps, offices, processing plants, ports, electric power lines, land, rail, air, and water boats, and so on. But the offsites are not only composed of works related to the extraction and production of lithium or even mining. For some time now, migrants have also become relevant to these socioscapes, along the refractory delusions that which one gets habituated while living in the desert, as well as to very busy and supersized transit of these roads. We now see migrants walking. The vast majority are usually young and middle-aged men alone, though it is no longer uncommon to see entire families with their babies and pet dogs just walking along the road. In an ongoing dialogue with Cristobal Bonelli, we have reflected on these scenes, which he had referred as the omissions of the transition. Offsites are in constant transformation. They contain invisible worlds that are created, transformed, and even vanished with the progression of mining, under the logic that everything that threatens the unstoppable 24/7 operation must be terminated. Lithium extraction has been underway for almost 4 decades. It has accelerated over the last 10 years due to the growing demands of the so-called electromobility revolution, which seeks to replace fossil fuels. But this boom is also based on potentialities, on a not yet. Green transitions paradigms pronounce a future that it will arrive, it should arrive, it has to arrive. But not only has it still not arrived, it is likely a future that many of us will not reach, not only because our birth dates, but also because we are looking toward a future where millions of people will be killed by toxic air poisoning and lack of clean water. In the middle of the tour that I was given at SQM chemical plant, I asked an almost rhetorical question. I wonder how much a ton of lithium cost. I was thinking about the sacrifice zones, the socio-environmental damage, human and non-human loss, impacts on local communities, the growing socioeconomic inequalities in the Antofagasta region, in Chile, and so on. The engineer who led the presentation at the visit in the plant, answered proudly, "I know that one. I did the calculations. It's about $2,000." End quote. In that moment, I couldn't properly explain what I meant by cost, right? So I simply asked if that included working hours, food, workers, commute, transporting of products, electricity, plant maintenance, etc. Yes, 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 all that. We have it figured out, he stated. This would not be the only moment in which the micropolitics of mining would become relevant, with an explicit reasoning concern with production cost, where the so-called liabilities and assets, both social and environmental, are completely monetized. But this cost of production certainly does not include infinite concerns most of us share. Just as an example, this cost doesn't include death. Going back to the news I brought before on the potential toxicity of lithium, Some interested parties from the industry have declared that an inappropriate classification of lithium salts would create business uncertainty and affect future investments. And even more, in some specialized news portal, as you can see, we can read an almost ironic yet sincere headline, such as EU's proposed lithium classification as toxic, likely to cause harm. Again, welcome to Mining Micropolitics. While having once the afternoon tea in Chile at his house in Antofagasta, a mine worker once told me, draw blood from me or anyone else around here, and you will find the entire periodic table. We are all these elements. We have them all. He did not consider himself an activist, but he had been a union delegate for 12 years, half of the time that he worked in SQM, until he got fired, and then he never got a job again. He spent many years fighting for better working conditions and denouncing socio-environmental damage, but living in Antofagasta or neighboring places like Mejillones or Tocopilla, he could not think of any work alternative less harmful to his health. Yes. In my opinion, we might craft the tone, the way, the art of paying attention to these lives. This is much more complex than complaining against extractivist mining model that unquestionably destroys forms of human and non-human life. If I open my eyes to what is happening in the north of Chile, I must think farther than a change in the energy matrix. One of the things I learned there in my daily life and in my anthropological work is having to make a great effort to overcome the most basic, linear, and ideologically founded preconceptions. It turns out that extractivism in the north of Chile is much more than a mode of production. It is a way of life, and one of the few means of living that have allowed people far from the center of the country to feel some kind of national belonging. Under any circumstance, I am saying that there is such a thing like a good extractivism or a possible green capitalism. I am simply pointing out that the extractivist machine has worked in such profound ways with such terrifying strategies that there is a cellular level in which it is installed. Biopower and necropolitics are playing along through mechanisms of control that have been generated by the extractive companies, and also they have been internalized by the workers themselves over the decades. Before reflecting on energy transitions in Chile, we might want to discern the many other political and economic transitions needed to stop over the current model: mining dependency, socio-environmental damage, lack of healthcare and labor works, existence of sacrifice zones, all of which are still structured by a hegemonic, racial, patriarchal, and colonial capitalism. To conclude, I invite you to think on this quote from science and technology historian Michelle Murphy. Breathe in. With each inhalation, the extensive relations of finance capital are pulled into your lungs, passing through membranes, attaching to receptors, rearranging metabolism, altering gene expression. Breathe out. With each exhalation, you are reconnecting to the greater abundance of our relations. Breathe in. Feel the fragility of white privileged life for the few around you. Breathe out, and end quote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina, for this presentation, touching presentation. If there are any clarification questions, we have 2 minutes now for that. Just clarification questions. We will have a debate after the pre-presentation.
Just clarification about the written version. I wasn't quite sure if it was an intentional, but you wrote socio escapes. And I thought that was interesting. I wasn't sure what you were referring to.
Yes, because some people are already using the notion of mining states in strict relation, of course, to landscapes affected by mining. So I did that differentiation in the sense that I was talking about the migrants. So I think that it's a much more complex case rather than
So you meant escape, not escape.
escape.
Because you wrote socio escape.
No,
That's
no,
not
that would be
escape. What does that
interesting. No, I know what you mean. No, then I corrected in my.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, we should explore
Yeah.
that idea as well.
That's a great idea. Anyway. I wish it was an escape. I don't think it is.
Anyone else? Okay, so thanks again, Marina. And we will move now to our next presentation, which will be an online presentation by Sane Datava and Annie-Sophie Hobby. But Sane will present. Oh, there is a mistake.
Yeah, no, can you, okay, where do I go now?
Okay, but I will present you, Sane.
Yeah, sure.
Morning. Like, Sane Datava is a PhD candidate at the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Culture Center for Technology and Society in the Norwegian University of Science and Technology.
She should be able to show without being coerced.
Okay.
She's, sorry?
Can you ask if she can share her?
Can you try to share your presentation
Sure.
so we make sure it works?
Is she co-host?
Maybe you can make her co-host.
Okay, she's there. Okay, great. So she's currently working on her PhD project, Innovation, Engagement, and Justice across the life cycle, a sociotechnical analysis of resource flows serving Nordic mobility transition, where she's looking at the processes needed for energy transitions in the Nordics. Her approach is to follow the whole life cycle of batteries, from the extraction of raw materials to the production, and including the ethnographic insights into afterlife of the batteries. Anna-Sophie Hobby is a PhD candidate at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, focusing on energy futures and battery production in Norway. She's taking part in an international research project called Green Courses and Violent Conflicts, the security implications of renewable energy sector development in Africa. And she studied anthropology in Basel, Switzerland. So thanks so much, Sane, for being with us this morning, and the floor is yours now.
Thanks. This presentation, Industrial Futures on Imagining Nordic Battery Towns, is based on a research done in northern Norwegian towns Mo I Rana and Narvik, as well as in Skellefteå in Sweden, where the authors, so me, Sane Datava, and my colleague Anne-Sophie Hobby, conducted fieldwork together. And we were focusing on the town's industrial future with the battery factories, co-living with the battery gigafactories, and interviews with municipality and industry representatives, politicians and residents gave insights into local imaginaries and hopes for change connected to implementation of the battery factories. So electrifying of transport in the name of green transitions is in full swing, and Nordic countries are building up their position in the battery production. Ambitious plans for the construction of gigafactories are being implemented with the aim to produce the greenest lithium-ion batteries. So here you see in the map the towns we are talking about. And so the company Northvolt, after a national competition in 2017, selected Skellefteå in Sweden to host one of Europe's first gigafactories to produce lithium-ion batteries. Following the Swedish example, a similar project was released in Mo I Rana in 2019, and 2 years later, plans for a battery gigafactory were announced in Narvik. The emerging industry comes with promise of several thousand workplaces. For the smaller towns around the Arctic Circle, the expected population growth presents prospects of awakened towns worth living in. Skellefteå, Mo I Rana, and Narvik have a rich industrial history based on mineral production, and they have experienced stagnation and out-migration over several decades. So shortly about the towns, Boliden in Sweden, which is located near Skellefteå, is a gold mine and other mineral mine. And so one of the everyone has worked here once in their lifetime, my local guide Gustav commented. He is from Skellefteå and worked here as a young man himself. Boliden mine, around 50 kilometers further inland from Skellefteå, became Europe's biggest gold mine at the time. Not surprising, Skellefteå city, which benefited massively from the surrounding resources, received the nickname Guldstaden, or Gold City. The gold rush led to...
Sorry, we can still see the same slide, just to make sure. I think you changed the slide. We can only see your PowerPoint interface. We don't see presentation mode. I think you're sharing another screen or another application.
Okay, interesting. I am on the third slide, so you're not there.
Yeah, we're still seeing the first one. I think you have to share another window, stop the screen sharing and then share the window of the full screen PowerPoint presentation. That works.
But she just needs to press the...
You still see the same one?
She shares another application.
You still see the same, or?
Yes. You can also share instead of sharing one application, share the entire screen, I think. But you have to exit the screen sharing and then. Sorry about that.
Window without going full screen. Or we can just listen to what she has to say.
Yeah.
Is it? What do you see now?
It's still the same.
Okay.
You would have to go in Zoom and stop the screen sharing. I can. Now it's good. Yeah, let's go on with that. You can just use maybe this, change it on this.
Okay, you can see now the
yes.
map?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, now it's good.
Okay, sure. Okay, so that was the map part, and now I'm on the next slide. Okay, about Boliden. Can you see that now?
Yes. Good.
Yeah, sure. And so the town grew from 5,000 inhabitants to over 30,000 in the 70s. Close by the gold mine, the mining company built up a complete settlement from the scratch. The small town with numerous family houses became known as model society. The mineral production steadily increased, and Boliden was the biggest private employer in Skellefteå in the post-war period and still is today. Together with mineral resources, forestry and hydropower, Boliden shaped Skellefteå's industrial and social history throughout the 20th century. It was a very masculine city. There was a lot of talk about hockey and heavy industry. An interlocutor in the municipality leadership described Skellefteå. Since the late 60s, Skellefteå's population has remained on the same level. In fact, from the 90s, the number of inhabitants decreased while the population's average age increased, above the Swedish average. During the fieldwork in Skellefteå, we met with several employees of the municipality who have been working with societal development in the past years. One of our interlocutors explained how Skellefteå had a negative image on out migration for quite some time. She said, it's about 100-year out migration. Raw materials and resources were found, and in a way that we have been just a resource for Sweden. That has created a lack of self-confidence, I believe, in many places already a long time ago. And in the 90s, there was a distinct stagnation. Many moved away from here. There was a high unemployment. That was an arduous period around the time I went to high school. Many of my age then moved away. While Skellefteå faced downward trend, other cities in northern Sweden could count more inhabitants every year. Stagnation poses a challenge to the municipality, having to cover for welfare and services with shrinking tax revenues. But it is more than about financial stability. As another employee at the municipality put it, Skellefteå has declined. There was a big need to try to change the picture of Skellefteå and create faith in the future. Skellefteå municipality therefore initiated a development strategy process and dialogue with its inhabitants in 2014. The vision is for Skellefteå to grow, to become an attractive municipality to work in, and to increase the population to 80,000. One, if not the most important step, was to attract industry and business to create workplaces. Their growth ambitions were successful. In 2017, Northvolt decided to place a battery gigafactory in Skellefteå. Like Skellefteå, Mo i Rana, and Narvik are heavily shaped by the industrial history. Whether you reach Mo i Rana by train or car, the industrial character of the town is impossible to miss. Proudly placed on the hill above the town, the old iron works and surroundings are today hosting over 100 companies gathered in Mo Industrial Park. After a national steel crisis, which followed the Second World War, the Norwegian government decided to build up steel production in Mo i Rana. The works that opened in 1955 were built on 3 cornerstones: ore, water, and people. Iron ore was mined industrially in the region since the late 19th century and led to societal changes in Mo i Rana, which until then was mostly based on barter and agriculture. Often proudly mentioned by locals, the ores even attracted Thomas Alva Edison to establish Dunderland Iron Ore Company in Storforshei outside of Mo i Rana. An iron ore rush attracted almost 2,000 adventurers, traders, and workers to the region. Already in the early 20th century, hydropower plants were constructed on the waterfalls around Mo i Rana. After a period of recession and decreased mineral production in the years following the First World War, new hopes were sparked when the government appointed Iron Committee and considered building a national iron and steel production in Mo i Rana. The iron works opened in 1955 and were received with optimism, although it raised questions around what kind of urbanized society and wider economic impacts the industry will bring to Rana. An immediate issue to the municipality was building enough housing for the thousands of workers to come. With almost 2,000 workers in the late 50s, the population grew quickly to 26,000. Despite the boom time in Rana and the socio-economic relevance of the ironworks, it was not profitable. Throughout the decades, its feasibility and national ownership was politically disputed. Nevertheless, it remained a national industrial symbol and remained state-owned. After the steel crisis in the 70s and restructuring of the Norwegian industry, the parliament voted to shut down Norsk Jernverk in 1988. They Stortinget turned their back on Rana, wrote the local newspaper Raneblad the following day. But followed was a massive restructuring and time of change in Mo i Rana. The industry was privatized and split into smaller companies. In support, the state provided a financial package of 500 million Norwegian kroners for the restructuring and of the Rana society and placed national institutions such as National Library and the National Tax Office in Mo i Rana. For almost 120 years, Narvik has been the port from where Swedish iron ore has been shipped out to the world. The Ofotbanen from Kiruna to Narvik was built in the 19th century. The town's main economic activity has been transport, storage, and shipping of iron ore that came from LKAB's iron mines in Kiruna. Narvik was built around the iron industry. Consequently, it has been dependent on the global iron market. Narvik was hit hard when the Great Depression in 1929 stopped ore exports. During the 50s, Narvik experienced enormous economic and population growth, but already in the mid-60s, this trend turned the opposite way, and Narvik became one of Norway's most prominent examples of out-migration. Restructuring, modernization, and industrialization decreased the workforce at LKAB. This affected the industrial society of Narvik massively. Nevertheless, LKAB is still the most important company today. As local politicians put it candidly, we are built around LKAB. They come first, then the municipality, then all of us others. The 3 towns studied do not only have a strong industrial history in common. Since mid or late 20th century, stagnation and downward trends have labeled Skellefteå, Mo i Rana, and Narvik with a somewhat negative image. In Mo i Rana, despite the successful transition, Rana municipality is facing worrisome demographic development today. It had roughly the same population since the mid-60s. However, in recent times, there is downward trend towards overaging and moving away. An aging population is not unique to Rana, but for most municipalities in Norway, especially outside of larger urban centers. This distribution challenges the sustainability of Norwegian welfare state, the government warns. This development means more than a financial squeeze. Jakob, a younger interlocutor, was actively engaged in social development while working in the industry. He was concerned that the area he had grown up in could, in worst-case scenario, die out. If not, the fast-growing industry here will be all people's homes. That is not a society one wants to move back to. It is then simply that you must shut down the whole thing. For Jakob, new industrial workplaces could turn around the demographic challenges of the area. What is the alternative? Industry is the economic driver in all rich countries. It is the industry that provides production growth. Nobody disagrees that industry is important for prosperity and welfare. My interlocutor was certainly not alone in his hopes for industrial growth. In fact, Rana municipality's official vision is to become Norway's green in the industry capital. The future is renewable, as they say. So as the solution, battery gigafactories come in the picture. The prospect of population growth because of large-scale battery production have sparked imaginaries of lively towns to come. In Skellefteå, Mo i Rana, and Narvik, companies are planning and constructing battery gigafactories. Yet the examples are at different stages, with Sweden furthest ahead. The projects rely similarly to earlier mineral industries in the north on natural resources, water and people. The three Nordic locations are rich in waters and rivers. Green hydro is one of the key factors for battery production to be in the Nordics. A second one is available land as a local resource. To the contrary, many of the mineral resources necessary for battery production are currently sourced from further away on the globe. Lastly, with the current demographics, the low employment rate in the region, and because of the lack of expertise, people will have to come from further away.
You have 2 minutes left.
Okay.
That's for you to know.
Yes. Okay. So what is the battery promise? Many interlocutors immediately drew our attention to an optimism and enthusiasm they experienced. Excitement seems to be shared widely, and the majority seems positive to the development. 92% of Skellefteå inhabitants want their town to grow, according to citizen survey conducted in 2021. Compared to 6% that expect negative consequences, 81% expect positive effects of growth. Citizens, municipal employees, and local politicians have been curious about the enormous development and shared with us how they imagine or hope the towns to be changing. Growth, both in terms of municipal economy, local business opportunities, and increase in the population are anticipated to lead to more lively, more international, and bustling town with improved services and more activities. A town that is worth living in and that is worth being proud of. In February, I met an employee at Rana municipality. We met at the town hall, an impressive building erected in 1969 with visible traces of time. After I commented that the battery factory and the influx of people is adding to the municipal revenues, he answered in a firm voice, "That is not the driver, this is about meaning." He further elaborated. It is connected to values, to vision, to meaning, something that you are not controlling yourself fully, the feeling of succeeding, the feeling of meaning something, the feeling of engagement. The future imaginaries connected to battery industry to come might relate to the global climate crisis, but are rooted in local pasts and futures. Even though these gigafactories are either not yet built or not yet producing batteries, still their coming to those towns had real effects before the construction of the gigafactories even started. If not in Norway, then where else? We have everything needed for establishing battery gigafactories and the production of the batteries, cheap and green energy, educated labor force, and the experience from the past industrial projects. Companies and municipalities have matching visions. However, concerns about the climate change seems less central than the importance of feeling of being a part of something new and exciting and globally and nationally accepted as good and as green, and what could eventually bring prosperity and growth to those towns. This is where future imaginaries of the municipalities and the industry actors meet. They are not necessarily the same, but are overlapping, co-created, and are influencing each other. It is a good match between companies and municipal futures. There is a strong belief in industry as samfunnsbygger, which is an equivalent to the idea of industry as co-creator of a society and its unity of a variety of levels. To attract workforce for the factories, also the industry is interested to create attractive towns. So to conclude, while the narratives of green transitions and the climate crisis are global, their manifestations are relying on local infrastructures and are historically and socially embedded. The narrative of greener future is uniting all the battery places we have studied. The battery projects operate as an enabler of places' futures. If you would be looking at the risks and potentiality of battery factory to not succeed, then the future of these places would be seen as endangered without them. Both the battery companies and municipalities have overlapping agendas and therefore willingness to cooperate the futures. The gradual implementation of the battery project visibly confirms a battery future to materialize. The head office has been opened, construction works have started, people are getting employed at the company, all of which is almost daily reported on by the local newspapers. Practices of imagining are actively used, relating not only to the future, but also to the past. And those help to deal with changes, risks, and uncertainties to come. Now the battery factories are seen as a solution not only for green energy transitions, but also, or locally even more so, as an enabler for the mere existence of these towns. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanne. Well, I'm afraid we don't have time now for the clarification question, but if there is something very, very short, or we can go back to your presentation in the general discussion. So let's move to our next presentation by Diana Ayer. Welcome, Diana. Diana is a researcher at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig, Germany, and she has recently associated as a fellow at the Marian Institute for Advanced Studies in Africa, in Accra, Ghana, where she worked on mine closure in Burkina Faso and Guinea. From 2016 to 2019, she was a member of the Collaborative Research Center 1199, Processes of Spatialization under the Global Condition at Leipzig University, where she completed a PhD on industrial gold mining and corporate responsibility in Burkina Faso. The current research focuses on temporalities of extraction and citizen science approaches in West African and German post-mining regions. She is particularly interested in studying the enactments of global ideas of responsible mining from an ethnographic lens. So thanks for being with us, Diana, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and welcome to my presentation on the topic of transforming waste into value, assembling German mining dams as places of and for decarbonized future making. So my presentation is also based on assumptions and estimates that the low carbon future will be very mineral intensive because the so-called clean energy or low carbon technologies need more materials than fossil fuel-based electricity generation technologies. So here on the right-hand side, we can see an illustration of the World Bank document Minerals for Climate Action, mapping the minerals needed for the development of low carbon technologies. And what is maybe also interesting at this point is that coal and gas are also listed under the prison of low carbon technologies or under this category. So for several years now, the global and particularly also the Europe mining sector increasingly aligns itself with a global sustainability agenda through concepts such as the circular economy, the coming energy and resource transition, a zero waste economy, etc. So I'm particularly interested whether those combined approaches of remediation and secondary mining in Europe go beyond what Stuart Kirsch has termed sustainable mining, which represents a corporate oxymoron, and that it reconciles the remining and decontamination approach, in that it reconciles the new demand for the so-called energy transition methods with the rehabilitation of former mine sites. So in this presentation, I'm investigating these kinds of projects in the European Union and also beyond. And I'm particularly interested in the mechanisms and techniques of rendering mining waste and dumps into valuable resources, and the potential impacts and contestations around these issues. So I will first elaborate on the theoretical approaches of making things public or rendering objects into issues of public concern, and how also the opposite may be the case. And before introducing a specific project on mine rehabilitation and secondary mining in the East German ore mountains, I will contextualize the recent search in transdisciplinary research projects on remining in Europe and their use of the concept of the so-called social license to operate. And I will then point to the empirical material of so-called citizen science field research in the German ore mountains and contestations around the different means and meanings of re-evaluating mining dumps as places of and for decarbonized future making. So analytically, I'm approaching mining temporalities through both the mining cycle itself and the social, economic, and environmental afterlives of extraction, and also the very moments tailing facilities and waste management may or may not be made into an issue, what several authors has called the so-called politics of time. So findings in the anthropology of waste and STS also show that waste gathers public interest and becomes an issue, notably when existing infrastructures pose threats to human health or to the environment. And I think one of the most prominent examples is the Brumadinho tailing dam failure in 2019, when the subsequent mud flow caused the death of 270 people in Brazil. And as a quite immediate reaction, there has been the implementation of a global industry standard on tailings management, where one of the biggest lobby organization of the world's biggest mining firms, the International Council on Mining and Metals, was involved. So I'm stating or I'm following here also an approach of Latour, stating that publics gather around issues, but they can also fall back to sleep. So there are mechanisms to construct waste management as an issue or a non-issue of public concern. For instance, through specific research agendas and forms of engagement or non-engagement with the public. It is also the type of instrument used to deal with an issue that impacts its definition and the way it is managed. And here I will notably focus on the so-called social license to operate. So coming to the EU project. So my argument is here that in the EU, we can observe a surge in transdisciplinary research projects on remining, and whereby scientists and experts contribute significantly to policy making. So to name just a few examples, there is the Crocodile project with a focus on cobalt, the Nemo project, or the Tarantula project aiming to recover tungsten, niobium, and tantalum. So at least since 2008 and the launch of the EU Commission's Raw Materials Initiative, the European Union aims to increase and revive mining in Europe to secure raw material supply for its industry. And remining notably became an issue in 2016 when the European Innovation Partnership on Raw Materials launched a so-called call to arms to transform the extractive waste problem into a so-called resource recovery opportunity. And as this resource recovery opportunity happens in an extractive context, we can also observe that the EU funding scheme Horizon 2020 required a SLO, a social license to operate strategy, to be implemented in the proposals. So paradoxically, the Horizon 2020 project in charge of developing a European approach to the social license to operate with the development of a respective toolbox and guidelines, and which also had an advisory function for remining projects regarding community involvement, met harsh criticism from a coalition of civil society organizations. So the project is called Mireo. And here civil society organizations mainly rejected the concept of the social license to operate as coined by the mining industry 2 decades ago. and which was notably developed as a management tool for local risk management. So in a joint civic statement published in 2020, they stated, the signatory movements reject both the term stakeholder and SLO as a pejorative denominations born within the context of socio-political risk management of industrial enterprises. So these questions also play a key role in a transdisciplinary research project on tailings management and remining in the East German ore mountains, where mining activities gradually came to an end until 1919. So this local alliance, with support of a broad public community, is not funded by the European Union, but by the German Federal Ministry of Research and Education, in the funding stream of promoting transformation in structurally weak regions. So in this project, the sites of the former mining and smelting industry in the ore mountains are perceived as real-world laboratories for the development of decontamination and remining technologies. So the project's aim is to develop innovative solutions and for the remediation of contaminated sites and the extraction of the remaining raw materials. And in its research design, and also due to the involvement of social scientists in this project, the project follows a citizen science approach and public involvement on a so-called eye level via participatory formats such as dump tours, information events, etc. But this does not necessarily correspond to the responsible implementers' visions and to the implementers of the technology development projects. So I'm arguing that there are different meanings and means of rehabilitation in place. For example, that mining dumps closed since the 1990s at least function today as important biotopes. So this is illustrated by an environmental organization contesting the potential decontamination and remining activities at the Bilatal tailings pond, which contains important deposits of lithium. They stated, since its closure, the former Bilatal tailings pond has developed into a highly valuable habitat for numerous endangered animal and plant species. A renewed mining operation must be avoided at all costs. Another important theme is the function of tailing storage facilities as cultural heritage sites. So here we have the example of the tailings pond Davidschacht, comprising important tin and copper deposits, which is part of the UNESCO Heritage Sites core zone since 2019, when the whole German ore mountains became an UNESCO heritage site. So we can observe a conflict of interest between, on the one hand, the end goal of remediation, extraction, and finally the removal of the tailings pile, and on the other hand, the preservation of the historic view and infrastructures. There are also two different means of reevaluation and practices of engagement with the public in place when it comes to considering the different visions of future use of the tailing piles. So on the one hand, we have a citizen science approach, including the engagement often with the public in an open-ended way and continuous and equal deliberation and reflection, comprising equally the right to say no to such projects. But we also have, on the other hand, narratives on an SLO or concepts of an SLO approach to public acceptance with the functional goal of participation by development developers, or by technology development. So there is, for instance, the narrative of letting sleeping dogs lie to avoid overt opposition to this project. So project implementers are afraid of so-called social media shitstorms, protest camps on their tailing ponds, etc. We can also observe a certain politics of time which they're using. So the public involvement is not necessarily necessary or desired before technology projects are visibly implemented. And then there's also a tendency to limit the stakeholder concept to communities living nearby projects and to exclude opponents. So this concerns notably representatives of different or also specific regional and environmental groups. So now coming to my conclusion on assembling mining dumps as places often for decarbonized future making. So in the course of sustainability transformations and also claims for sustainability transformations, mining waste and dumps become revalued. And so this image or this narrative turns garbage and waste into value. And we can observe here an issue formation. But the meanings and means of reevaluation, as I have demonstrated, are highly contested. So there are different visions for future use. For instance, conflict between the historical and natural conversation issues, so using those sites as sites of natural protection and historical heritage, and their use as the source of critical or for critical minerals. So there are also different means of re-evaluation. So we have here this engagement of and with the public in an open-ended way versus the functional goal of public acceptance and the reduction of approvals to narrow bureaucratic processes. So those selective and bureaucratized forms of engagement, I'm arguing, tend to silence the expression of diverse public values and underlying issues, which I try to demonstrate in my presentation. And we also have this tendency to limit negotiations and exchanges to specialists and scientific experts in predefined arenas. So issues in publics, they can also fall back to sleep. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Diana. If there is any clarification question about Diana's presentation. If there is not any clarification question.
Thank you.
There is one.
There is someone there. Nona, you can.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Diana. Nice to see you. Thank you for your presentation. It's really great to hear. I know the project from earlier stages, and it's great to see how it has developed. I was wondering, could you say a bit more about the formats of engagement, like thinking about that publics are also evoked by the means in which they are addressed, as for example, this book, Remaking Participation, describes Chilvers and so on. I was wondering if you could expand a bit more about how these forms of how to engage with these people have an effect on how publics fall to sleep or stay alert or whatever, or whether also how these means maybe differ between the environmental groups and the more functional bureaucratic ways of engaging people.
So departing, thanks for your question, Nona. So departing maybe from the research design, the project is designed in a framework of experimental research, so also engaging with the public quite from the beginning of the project, and that people are also involved in the makeup of the projects. And in reality, this is not really the case. So we as social scientists, we are rather demanded to organize public events for the acceptance of the projects. And also the formats we have tried to introduce, such as mining dump tours and so on, or public events, where those questions are really debated, where different opinions can also be heard. What is one mechanism is that they are constantly delayed. So, which is also due to structural constraints, such as the corona pandemic, for instance, but also due to different visions of on public engagement of the project implementers. And what is also one mechanism is to exclude specific stakeholders. There's one environmental group called the Grüne Liga in Saxony, and they are viewed as a specific, difficult stakeholder or actor to engage with. And so this also falls back on the organization of public events. So there's also this tendency that if representatives of this organization will be present, then we don't want to have public events at all. So just to name a few.
Perfect. Perfect. So we come back to that discussion later on. And so thank you for all the presenters, speakers. And now we have the pleasure to welcome our discussant, Simone Abram. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Simone Abram is professor in the Department of Anthropology at Durham University. She qualified in electrical and electronic engineering at Manchester University. Then she studied social anthropology at Oxford University, and after a field on history and heritage in the French Auvergne, she turned to questions of governance with research on local and regional planning in the UK and Norway. Her work now spans the fields of governance, tourism, and energy. Since 2014, her research has moved into energy issues, and she's currently a co-investigator at the National Center for Energy Systems Integration. She also continues research in Norway as co-investigator at the Include Center for Social Inclusive Energy Transition and as co-investigator on materializing kinship. So thank you very much, Simone, for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for three very rich and interesting and very diverse papers. There are many themes, I think, in common, but I'm just going to try and pick out a few that I think are relevant and maybe cross over into the next section. I was really struck in Marina's paper about the discussion of, apart from the socio-escapes, which we'll have to come back to another time, this world of not yet that will arrive, one that is it's actually destroying its own futurity in the vision of a clean future somewhere else. And the fact that you mentioned specifically that death is not accounted for. And I think life and death is really what these papers are all about. So in the IO paper, mining has receded into the past. It's something that is over. And nature has emerged as a kind of a new vocation for the landscape. So there's this urgency of other environmental imperatives like climate change, clean energy. They now compete with the preservation of a biome that's recolonized the waste pit. So this pit has been reborn and its former life is now a threat, and life has replaced that death. Whereas in the Norwegian-Swedish case, this receded industrial past of these northern towns remains an object of desire. So the decline of these towns is seen as death. The desire is then for revival, not for rebirth or something else. So all these sort of feelings, pride, meaning, purpose, they're all associated with work. And the town expansion, the original town expansion was based on industry, and industry kind of remains this motivating force. And you wonder whether that ideology has changed at all with the kind of changing times. I know that both of these contexts could also be related to Protestant work ethic, but perhaps that's a question that needs to be interrogated separately. So that paper and the IA paper are all about reimagining a changing landscape. And it reminded me of the work in the 1980s about heritage, particularly asking at what point, which moment in a changing past becomes the moment that defines history, that's then ossified into something that can be romanticized and stand in for a past that we need to regain or that we need to celebrate and that defines us. And that's a question about how the past should be presented for the future and in the future. Whereas I think in these studies, what we're looking at is which elements of the past should be reinvented as futuristic, which is slightly different. It's interesting that in neither case, money is seen as a driver, right? Environmental ethics are core here. Sustaining the climate, sustaining the biosphere, sustaining community. But in lithium extraction, I mean, Marina makes it incredibly clear that we see industrial way of life as it is. It's dirty, it's exploitative, it's extractive, disease-inducing, unavoidable. And Marina describes it as still structured by a hegemonic, racial, patriarchal, and colonial capitalism. So it's unutterably driven by the financial speculation on global markets that intervene to facilitate trade and growth, to reduce all of these very diverse costs to a financial enumeration, or enumeration even. And that, I think, crosses over into the next section where Daniela de Soto's paper talks about how extractive cosmology overlays and undermines a more unifying indigenous desertscape. I was going to say desertscape. We're all about scapes today. You know, and she talks about this breaking the world into fragments, which reminded me of Mark Goodale's work on a revolution in fragments. So you have this kind of fragmentation, which is driving the goal of a globally unified mining scape. So we're kind of reinventing mining all the time as a kind of global, and yet it's global in a kind of geographical sense, but not global in a cosmological sense. It has its own restricted cosmology. And what it does is that it hides the costs of this clean life that lives elsewhere. They're systematically concealed in this financial world. And another paper in the next session that Selena Gallo-Cruz talks about the pains that scientists and researchers go to conceal the true message of the limits to growth, because limits to growth does not work in that discussion area. So you have to convey it in a different way. And that, I think, is also going on here. This is unsaid element of all of these descriptions. So one of the overriding questions for me for these papers and for the ones in the next section is about the variety, but also the paucity of future visions that's on offer here. You know, what's the repertoire of futures and past that people are using to frame their vision of how to live? And how does the vocabulary of industrial modernization shape what's possible to imagine? You know, what happens when these discourses bump up against materialities like the reinvention of waste as resource, or you know, waste confronting the fairy tale endings of technological infrastructure, which I think Pauline's paper is interrogating as well. And I guess I would also look for further thoughts about anticipatory strategies, so calling on Geza Vashkalet's work on anticipatory economies of oil. What are the anticipatory strategies and their modes that accompany these other energy ambitions? So I've just got a kind of series of questions really about how traditions of discourse, regimes of values, narratives of origin and temporalities, how do they emerge and re-emerge and reproduce and evolve? Are they repeating themselves? Are they becoming varied in different contexts? And how do what are sometimes called the little tools of governance or little tools of democracy carry these dominant visions over through alternate visions and conflicting interests? They're constantly reproduced, but we know that reproduction never happens alike. Every time it comes out a little bit different. So some kind of closer look at how these are evolving would be really interesting. And how do the temporalities of these kind of visions play or play out? How and where do futures, presents and pasts recede or swim into view? And how do the various very unequally distributed materialities, how do they present endurance or ephemeralities? And how relevant are terms like remediation, adaptation, mitigation for thinking about futures of an ecological sustaining humanity? So I'm interested in these kind of temporalities in the way that the discourses, I mean, evolve sounds a bit too progressive, doesn't it? But you know, when you're talking about a discourse of progress, how is it mutating, if you like, over time, and how is that playing out in these different contexts? So incredibly rich food for thought in all of these papers, and I look forward to a discussion of those. Thank you.
Maybe for Q&A, we can have a panel switch so it works with microphone. Third chair, and then you can sit here maybe. Otherwise, it will be a back and forth. Yeah, we only need two here.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's somebody.
Cheese.
Thanks so much, Simone, again, for your comments and questions. I would open up. Any Pablo?
Yes, thanks so much. I'm not really sure how to formulate this question, but I think all the papers have this sense that I like this image you were using of the public falling asleep, but also the idea of being suffocated. You said that you yourself felt suffocated. And I was just wondering, I get kind of, I'm working in the nuclear industry, and I kind of feel that there's always this problem that as you're describing this kind of distribution of where you can find some sense of possibility, tends to be people who are kind of inside the bubble, where it has become their life world in the way that a lot of people describe. And then there's different kinds of ways in which you get excluded and damaged in such an extensive space that it's hard to know where it begins and ends. And I was just thinking of how Cristobal started and saying this panel is trying to look for new concepts that help us to think of alternatives. And I just wondered in the different papers, I didn't get such a strong sense of where the alternative is really coming from, and or if you've come across any kinds of spaces, because it seems to me that this kind of ways in which people are choosing to stick with industry in this sense of completely compromised set of choices, as if they are choices that you're kind of floating into spaces that where there isn't any other space. And so I don't know, I end up feeling really hoping that you might have some sense of what, is it some kind of commons, or is there some kind of as yet not noticed space where people are actually, or is it that it isn't really about choice? I mean, kind of see it as if it's a kind of choice, but maybe there isn't any choice. And yeah, I don't know if you've got anything to respond to that.
Could you hear the question, people online? Could you? Okay.
I'm very pessimistic in general, so probably I will go first. I will leave to younger generations to talk about hope. But yeah, I think I've been wanting to point out with my research, just to visualize or to bring to the surface many other aspects in the case of within our project lithium extraction, but going further into mining extraction or extractive activity in the north of Chile, just to point out that energy transitions as such in this area of the world needs to pay attention to many other transitions in order to start thinking about it. And now there are a couple of examples. Well, there are always examples going on in Chile, but there is a very the last one. I think it's from a mine called Ventanas, which is part of Codelco, and there were it was a big battle between communities, local communities, which are highly affected by the pollution, against the workers because they didn't want to lose their jobs. So I'm just trying to point out with no hope, about we might want to pay attention to these situation, like specific situations for the case of Chile. And yeah, you're right when you talk about choices. I'm not that sure that there are many choices or there is room for changing the model like structurally, but just paying attention to these other subjectivities. As a, you know, if I were writing a policy paper, I would suggest that, you know, to local governments or national government, like to pay attention to these different actors. Not saying that this will solve the problem, but I don't know if you have similar ideas.
Well, not an easy question. Yeah, I would say, I mean, I think I'm a bit in between. So I'm also rather, I'm not that optimistic, but in a way, I also see that maybe there are new approaches of dealing with certain problems. And I think it's important yeah, to analyze whose voices are being heard and whose voices are not being heard. And I think in the context of resource extraction, new resource frontiers in Europe, and also the topic of remining, what always comes to my mind is that there's a lot of talk about the circular economy now, and everyone is focusing on recycling and less so on, for example, reducing consumption and reducing yeah, the use of resources to extract less in the end. Although I also think that, I mean, those remining decontamination projects could be a step towards solutions and alternative futures, but still we have to regard also we have to look into the ambivalences and the contestations around those issues to better also conceptualize alternative futures.
Zane?
Yeah, that's a good question about the choices, because in the cases I've been looking at, kind of seems that, at least from the narratives, that there is no choice in a way, both because they kind of, those places have those rich pasts and the cheap energy that it kind of asks in a way to be re-industrialized again, and kind of asks to yeah, to be used at the industry places. And there is more like the decline brings anxiety, not the risks of a new project, but this regression would bring more anxiety. And like local people who've been like growing up, like for instance in Mo i Rana, they were even saying like, yeah, it's a good place for industry to establish here, because we are used to live with the industry. We have had industry before. So that means like it wouldn't be a big shock for us. I'm used to the sounds of industry. It's kind of, it's the sounds I've been growing up with. So it's it makes sense in their narratives. Yeah, for just in a way, it's history repeating in all of those places. They had industry and now it's coming again. And the kind of the only change is that it's labeled as being green and it's supported, and but they experience already the same problems which they experienced before, like the housing problem, and then also have to attract actually people to come here, the workforce problem, have to attract people coming to far north. So yeah, it's about the change.
Thanks. So the question remains open. Is there any outside to this infernal alternative place, to say it in dangerous way? Seems like, yeah. Was Pablo in the queue, and then Simone, sorry, yes, and then Caroline. Pablo, Simone, Caroline. And then and Horacio, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, it's just one of the things that I found very interesting of these three presentations. And I think it's a larger socioeconomic element that somehow can make us think on the line of the previous question. I don't want to sound determinist, but one of the common things that you can find on the three cases that you present is that these are impoverished places. I can, in the case of in the Atacama Desert, the communities of the Atacama Desert are not particularly rich, or the people in the Erzgebirge, in the Ore Mountains, in Saxony, are kind of the losers of the Wende, right? So of the reunification of Germany. These are communities that have been impoverished for a long time. There has been a long history of migration from that area out to towards the west of Germany. And then Zanio showed us these towns where apparently only retired people were living and so on. So it really seems to me that there is a larger socioeconomic context here that we need to take into consideration when we try to think about the possibility of imagining alternatives. Growing in a precarious condition myself, I know that if there is a job available, you will just do it. If you have the chance to just make a living and make ends meet and at the end of the month, you would just do it, and probably your biggest concern wouldn't be the conditions of labor or the conditions of whatever. I mean, I also worked with migrant workers in China, and this is a very clear issue. So I guess my question goes a bit into that line of, is without sounding determined, I know that, and it really sounds like I'm going there, but I don't want to. It's just adding more food for thought here on what alternatives can emerge from this context of precarity. Is there really a possibility for us to think or to contrast this type of ethics of labor? I wish to work, and work is important for the meaning of my life, with kind of the ethics, if there is any, of capital, of the need to, bring development and all of that sort of kind of growth narrative. What are the pathways that can be open here? I mean, I know that some of you have worked with activists. So what are the pathways that can be open that combine this? Is degrowth, for example, an attractive possibility, or something of those sort of more theoretical alternatives as well?
I would say that perhaps we could collect comments. So then if part of those comments triggers some passionate answers, then you can decide what to.
Sorry about plotting in there, but Penny's comment made me think about this kind of moral economy of optimism. You mentioned ethics as well, which I think is really interesting. And there's quest for solution, which I think we collectively can be part of as well. We're concerned about the situation, we want to see some change, but there is a tendency to kind of moralize the position of different people in different positions. So, the kind of optimism of technologists and their desire to solve things for a better world, which we often contrast with the kind of cynicism of financial markets and so forth. So that kind of moralization of these problems is maybe something we need to bring to the surface a bit more clearly.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much, panelists, for discussing, for really bringing up some nice, fieldwork sites as well as reflections. So my question is maybe particularly to Marina and Zane, because you mentioned both the patriarchal power relations in place as well as masculinity in those towns that you discussed, Zane. So I was wondering, how is gender playing a role in all the things that you discussed, both in the impacts that are being experienced as well as in imagining new futures, and how are those two processes gendered?
Should we take this set of comment questions and then we go to yours, because otherwise it's going to make it too much for panelists. If you want to say something, or we keep on collecting some other comments and questions.
Yeah, well, I will be super brief. Yeah, taking the three comments all together. Yeah, I would, without taking your deterministic suggestion, yeah, I think that there is a level in which thinking in labor rights or environmental protection laws or a more ecological constitution in the case of Chile. There is I don't want to sound like old school, but there is some kind of national protectionism that could work a little bit, within this crazy globalized extractivist world towards greener futures in terms of national protection. So where Antofagasta region doesn't need to or cannot relate straight with some Chinese company, or from the port of Antofagasta, there are a whole bunch of regulations. Some kind of regulations that cannot allow or protect to some extent the activities that are going on in that area. And regarding the gender question, and then sorry, I think that probably those kinds of national measures can get to less unequal distribution of everything. So thinking in more optimistic terms, but I would just say that it's a highly masculine world in general. So to many levels, I will let Sane to develop on that, but the mining world, it's highly masculinized, as you can imagine. So I think if you take, for example, the ecofeminist approach, you will see that there is this exploitation over natural resources plus women, and there is a whole invisibilized world of women, not just within the mining activity, but in the domestic world, that it's supporting that resource exploitation in the case of Chile.
Yeah, I will maybe say some words on the comment of Pablo, which I also found very interesting. Those communities that have been impoverished, and what alternatives can emerge from context of precarity. I think the Erzgebirge, the East German ore mountains are an example out of this, but also for the complexities of these contexts. So people are rather impoverished, but there is also a lack of skilled workforce now. So people migrated out of those areas, and now with those new projects, the industry and also the scientific world, because there's also one of the oldest mining universities of Europe. They also want to recruit those skilled people. And I think there's also a lot of similarities with the Nordic battery towns. So people are rather being used to industry, and there are also potentials of learning from the past. And I think this is also an interesting topic which could be developed further, maybe also through ethnographic research. And maybe just one point also on those, what is the role now for these regions in this contemporary green capitalistic economy? So for instance, in the Erzgebirge, this research project, very close to the industry, but still a transdisciplinary research project, they do not want to necessarily develop solutions for the local context. They also want, or they notably want to export those solutions to other contexts, notably to countries in the global south. And so they also see the significance of the place, not only in terms of we still have important deposits or important resource deposits, but we want to export our technologies, our knowledge to the world. And here we have a whole bunch of also, neo-colonial imaginaries in a way also. And I think it's really important to keep attention to these power hierarchies, which then come into play again.
I can continue on the gender question, and I was reflecting on that, like, yeah, it's very masculine still, the industry, but in Skellefteå in Sweden, I was surprised in a way how many women there were on a leading level in a municipality, and like I talked that like things they were doing were like they were in a way gender related, how they were working on to make Skellefteå attractive to people, like having, for instance, every new inhabitant would after some time they would get like a welcome package with a backpack and some infos, and they were organizing events for them. So individually they would like look up and that there's a new inhabitant, and they would receive, they had a storage room full of those kind of souvenirs, but a good quality, like really they were thinking about those small things, like have to welcome new people, because they also, that maybe relates to also the degrowth question or question about the alternatives, because they really don't see the alternative. They kind of have experienced natural degrowth over a decade. So now they are really excited and like willing to like provide for people and to attract people to those Nordic towns. So yeah, and even though they also, like I said, they experience already the housing problem and then the growing prices, like in Mo i Rana, they were even comparing the prices of apartments to those in Frogner in Oslo, which is one of the richest areas, and simply because the housing market is smaller and they cannot build as quick as they should to provide. Yeah, so that's from me now.
So
Thanks, Sanne.
I just want
Very
to
short, yes.
very short to add something because it's the case of Chile is very different in terms of the north of Chile. It's a very desired place to go for working. You know, the housing market is flourishing constantly. So it's the, I think, I don't know if Pablo or Cristóbal has a different view, but or Daniela, but the north of Chile, it has been like this for the last 40, 50 years, but it's a very desirable place to go. So there are a lot of commuting, people living in the rest of the country, just going straight to the north of Chile because of the mining industry. It's and salaries are very high in relation to many other sectors in the country. So that also has become like a big conflict within the national population, because salaries might double or triple other areas of the industry there. So
okay, let's
yeah,
keep that conversation open, but I would like to take these two questions, you and Horacio, before finishing. We have 5 minutes. Perhaps we can extend a bit more, like 8 minutes before going to break. So try to be short, if possible. I think you were queuing.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, thanks so much for the papers. Really appreciated them. My question is to the three of you, a little bit related to Simon's question about these ideals of transformation from different places, and you all foregrounded the very extractive dimensions of those. But I wondered about the changing role of the industry in all of this. What is the kind of changing phase of this industrial transformation? Because industry seems really central in all of your papers, you know, really mediating between these resources, or the remediation of all resources and the communities around. And I didn't quite get a sense of how industrial actors really figured in that story, or in how communities so that kind of changing role of industry there. Simon mentioned, you know, that it seems to be all about environmental ethics rather than money, and that's really interesting in terms of how the industry positions itself there. And Diana, you mentioned these oxymorons that are proliferating in those industries. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit about that, and if you've explored that question from that interface between industry and the communities.
So thanks. Let's take Horacio. Horacio, you've been waiting for a while, so I apologize.
No. And also, I will have time to speak later, so I don't want to take much time. It's just I wanted to bring back the concept of anthropological imagination that is in the title, and one of the ways in which I see anthropological imagination operating is in the kind of analytic standpoint from which we look at problems, because the analytic standpoint in a way offers a view of what the world can be, not just of how it is. And so I think there is something going on there. And I say this because my question for the three presentations had to do with the global connections that can be observed in the sites that were presented. Although these global connections, I felt they were not very present in the presentations, but at the same time, the choice of the objects, industry, mining, imply global connections. Contemporary mining, contemporary industry is spread out in commercial connections. Simone mentioned finance, which is my research topic, and so whether we want it or not, a mine is a global site. And so I was wondering if in your work you're looking at that aspect, and if you are, how do you imagine that global? What are the global connections that you think are relevant for your analysis, for the sites you're observing?
So we have the phase of industries and what's the global. Just minor questions for the and you can perhaps try to give us a final punch if you want.
Well, yes, regarding to your question, very briefly, I see like technical and technological transitions in the north of Chile, because now we see not just mining activities, but energy enterprises. It's just like full, you see fields of solar panels and how do you say the energía eólica? Wind, yeah. So you see that, but when you ask about it, it turns out that those are just new forms of energy that are going to feed the mining industry, right? So this alternative or greener energy is not used for local communities. There are communities with no energy at all, for example, and they are just next to SQM plant. So that's what I meant by anthropology of mining and not anthropology of energy or transitions. And regarding to Horacio's question, in my case, I can rely on my project colleagues. So I am in charge of Chile. So in my anthropological imagination, while doing my field work, I always see Pablo on the other side of that ship. So I got to, actually, I end up my ethnographic fieldwork in the port of Mejillones, where the lithium, SQM and Albemarle companies just put their all the different types of salt. So I saw those ships, and then I just rely on that Pablo will take, the next part of my project. But of course, the global, it's always present. When I am in the Antofagasta region, wherever I am, I feel that I am just in one of the many sites that are needed in terms of within our project of this battery chain, right? So I have that feeling. I know that, but still, from an anthropological perspective, I want to grasp that global, but in a very local and intimate way. So that's me.
Okay, I will try to keep it brief. So your questions on the corporate oxymorons. Indeed, I find it interesting to apply this concept maybe also to science, because this concept of social license to operate and how it is criticized also is already analyzed also in the scientific world. But yeah, because those corporate oxymorons in my case, there is involvement of industry, but it is particularly a research project. But they're also collaborating with actors of the mining industry with or who want to develop also lithium mining projects in the East German ore mountains. So this comes also into play, but we have just two tendencies. So for Europe, we want to assure responsible supply chains, and then for our home industry, we want to adopt to the highest global standards for environmental protection and also community development. So this certainly comes into play here. And then to the question on the global dimension, there are a lot of global dimensions and connections, I would say. So as I have already mentioned, in the context of East Germany, this educational aspect, so the education, the formation of geoscientists, mining engineers, then going into the global mining labor market, and also this topic of the export of knowledge and technologies to other contexts around the world. And then when it comes to the local context in Germany, there are also those efforts, and this is also very interesting in terms of finance or the finance industry to make the place investable again. So, so one of the main arguments for that there are not yet so many mines in East Germany is not so much, is also the community resistance argument, so that people are not willing to accept again mining in Europe, but it is also the cost argument that mining in Europe is still too expensive, and this is also relevant for the finance industry.
I think Channel, you can be very.
Yeah, okay, briefly. Now I will just relate to the question of global connections, and obviously they are in the battery industry. Also, for the first, like, finances are mostly coming from elsewhere, because at least in Norway, because the governmentally it hasn't been like really supported until recently, and in Sweden is more supported. But then also, of course, the production, those countries aren't so big, so the production, the produced battery cells will also go elsewhere. So it's a very a lot of global connections, and at the same time relying on the local resources for the first, and cheap and sustainable energy from the water. And yeah, it's accelerated change in those places happening. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I think we are running out of time, so to leave it here, and we welcome you all for the next session if you can make it. Many things to say, but we need to stop. And thank you very much for everything to the presenters and to our discussion, Simone. So thank you.
For those online, the next session, although it's the same panel, it has a different Zoom room, so you have to look that up on the website.
Yeah.
So 11.
Just for staying calm and stuff, it's just back here on the left and downstairs in the Junction Cafe. That's where the sign goes viral.
Stop it.